My intention is to try to finish our journey through the Bible next week. I don't know how optimistic we ought to be that will happen. And to be totally honest with you, the main reason I want to finish it next week is because I just can't stomach the thought of having 41 lessons. And next week is 40. So perfect. I love round numbers. That's just a confession more than anything. I wish I was joking, but I'm not.
So you're going to get through the whole New Testament?
Well, we're not doing the New Testament because we're doing the New Testament. That's what we've already been doing.
So we're journeying through the Old Testament.
We're journeying through the...
So some of us got to go through half the Bible with the Old Testament, but those of us who miss the New Testament. Is that what happened?
Well, we started this new study of the life of Christ, and that'll pretty much be as in-depth of a journey through the New Testament as we could possibly get. So we're going to pick that up whenever we finish this journey. So that'll pretty much be picking up the New Testament where we would have begun anyway. So
We could journey with Paul.
that's a thought. We'll have to think about that, I guess. Journeying with Paul. That could be a good place to start after the life of Christ, to be honest, because that'll pick up right after that. Journeying with Paul through the book of Acts could be a really profitable study. Tonight is Esther. Just Esther. And we're going to get through Esther. Even if we don't. We're going to do it anyway. Just a quick recap. We started it last week at the very end, touched on it a little bit. The events of Esther take place about 483 BC to 473 BC, which puts it between the first and second returns. Remember, there were 3 returns of the Jews from 3 exiles, 3 deportations into Babylonia, and then there were 3 deportations back to Jerusalem. So the first one was under Zerubbabel, which took place in Ezra 1 through 6. That's what we covered last week. The second one doesn't happen for quite a few years, and in between Ezra 6 and Ezra 7, Esther fits. So Esther 1 through 10 chronologically comes after Ezra chapter 6. And then the second deportation back to Jerusalem is recorded in Ezra 7 through 10. So what we're looking at here is Esther 1 through 10 took place during the reign of Xerxes I. He's called Ahasuerus in Esther. I find Xerxes much easier to say, so I'm going to call him Xerxes. I hope you'll allow me to do that. We're told that he reigned from India to Ethiopia. India to Ethiopia. We'll see that. If you have a paper, you can see that on the map, which will show up in just a second. But Esther came upon the scene of the Jewish history here 40 years after the new temple was finished and 30 years before the wall was rebuilt by Nehemiah. So Esther, again, fits right in between Ezra chapter 6 and Ezra chapter 7, and then Nehemiah as well. So, like we pointed out last week, there was a 6-month period of preparation by Xerxes before they invaded Greece. And that is when that infamous war with the Spartans occurred. The stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae. That took place. That's what Xerxes was preparing for at this moment, at this time. And during that time is when this feast was going to be held, this great feast. And it says he sat on his throne in Shushan, is what some of the old versions say. And Shushan is Susa. So there were 4 capitals, like we said. One of them's covered up there by another mark on the map. 4 capitals of the Persian Empire, and the events of Esther took place at Susa. What does it say that was? Susa was the winter capital, I guess, so that's where they were. It was the 3rd year of Xerxes' reign. This guy right here, Xerxes the First. There's his tomb. There's a thing that they found. I don't know how they find this stuff and how you can carve into rock and find that. People that are smarter than I am, to say the least. But on the last day of this feast, Xerxes commanded the queen, Vashti, to come in and show her beauty. So we have the men having a feast in one place. We have the women all together having a feast at this other place, a women's banquet. And the queen receives word that the king summons her to come and show her beauty. And like I pointed out last week, doesn't necessarily imply that there was anything licentious about this. It could have been that she was supposed to expose herself in some way, but it doesn't seem, it's not necessarily the case. At any rate, she refused to come. And that didn't go over too well. So she's punished, banished, she's deposed from being queen, and banished. And the reason she was banished was to prevent other women from viewing and treating their husbands with contempt. The queen set an example of disregarding her husband, and they didn't want that to spread like wildfire through the empire. So they deposed the queen and banished her, which means they need a new queen. And about 4 to 5 years lie between Esther 1 and Esther 2. And during that time is when that famous battle was fought, the Battle of Thermopylae against the 300 Spartans. So in between Esther 1:22 and Esther 2:1, that great Battle of Thermopylae was fought. And as Xerxes wallowed in his sensuality, from shame really, he regretted that he expelled Vashti. And so what they were going to do, at the advice of his great mighty men that are always so trustworthy, they were going to turn the empire upside down for young virgins to cheer him up. Okay, that was the plan. And among these virgins, he was going to choose his favorite to be the new queen. These poor girls. But that's what they did. So, chapter 2, what chapter 2 records, at this point we meet the 2 protagonists of the book of Esther. One of them is the young Jewish girl named Esther. The book's title that's who the book is named after. The name Esther is Persian, by the way. It's not Hebrew, it's Persian. It means star. So, we also meet her cousin, who is pretty much like an uncle, but more like a father figure, really, named Mordecai, or Mordecai, I don't know. I think typically we say Mordecai. He was basically her foster father, according to verse 20. And when Esther was taken into this harem, she began winning favor, it says in Esther 2, verses 8, 9, and 15, winning favor in the eyes of all. Sounds like some other Bible characters we've met, doesn't it? Joseph, Daniel, Esther. They're sent to this strange place, and they're winning favor with everybody they come in contact with. Well, just like Joseph won favor, just like Daniel won favor with the chief of the eunuchs or whatever, now Esther's winning favor with that same person, whoever it would be under this new empire and this new regime. And that worked in her advantage, obviously. And long story short, And by the way, verse 11 says, every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Kind of a touching little detail there that he was concerned for her, obviously, and he went in front of that court where she was, and I guess was asking. I don't know if he got to speak to her directly, but at least he was asking about his young, basically foster daughter, Esther. Yep.
But he had told her not to expose her lineage.
Yeah.
And yet, by doing this, everybody knew he was a Jew. I would think that would have endangered her a little.
Yeah, I guess we can only assume that he did it discreetly in some way. I don't know how. It wouldn't make much sense for him to say, don't tell anybody you're a Jew, but then he's always hanging around asking about her or talking to her or anything like that. So, yeah, he probably had a way of doing it that would have protected her. If he thought that finding out she was a Jew would put her in danger, he's obviously not going to be so foolish as to accidentally expose that she's a Jew, by being so worried about her and asking about her. So he probably had a way of doing it that would also, so he could find out about her, but also protect her from any potential danger. So what we learn here in chapter 2, against all odds, and what we mean by that really is providence of God. By the providence of God, this young Jewish woman, Esther, becomes the queen of the biggest empire the world had ever known at this point, up to this point in history. What are the odds of that? Well, very slim. Even if she was chosen as one of the queens, which doesn't seem to indicate that, but even if, that's still very, very powerful and shows the providence of God. So Esther is now the new queen of Persia. This young Jewish woman. And by the way, I meant to mention from the beginning of this, the book of Esther is recording the history behind the feast of Purim, which is wasn't something from the law of Moses, but it was something that came later. And the book of Esther, what it's doing is recording what that feast is about, what it is commemorating, and how that happened. And what it's commemorating is the providential deliverance of the Jewish race from extermination. So that feast began, the observance of that feast began at the conclusion of the events of the book of Esther, and that's what the book of Esther is recording, is that the basis for that feast of Purim and how that all unfolded. So that's what we're looking at here in Esther. That's what we read about and learn in the book of Esther. Obviously, only God could have made any of this happen, including what's already happened. Of all the young, fair virgins in all the Persian Empire, of all different backgrounds and such, Esther is the one that's chosen by the king. So that's a big step in what is about to unfold. As with Joseph, as with Daniel, God elevated Esther to preserve the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, not for their sake, but to save the world. Because who would ultimately come from Esther's people? Give you a hint. Yes, exactly. Didn't even have to give you a hint. Well done. Jesus would come from them, and therefore God was looking ahead from our perspective. He's always in all time, but God is working behind the scenes because the Savior of the world is to come into the world. And if the Jews are exterminated, there won't be a Savior coming into the world. So, sometime later, as Mordecai is sitting at the king's gate, he overheard a plot against the king to assassinate the king. This is the kind of thing that happens all the time. Don't like the king? find a way to kill the king. We'll get a new king. If you don't like that king, let's kill the king, then we'll get a new king. And that could go on indefinitely. Well, Mordecai overhears, because Mordecai had the custom of sitting at the gate where people talked. Probably not the smartest idea to talk about an assassination plot at the gate, but apparently these people weren't the greatest thinkers of all time. But he ends up saving the king. He tells Esther, and Esther tells the king, Xerxes, and after investigating, the traitors and schemers were crucified. Again, the Persians invented crucifixion. And verse 23 says, it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So this deed that Mordecai did by overhearing this plot, reporting it, and it being found out and confirmed, and saving the king's life, at least potentially, was recorded in this book of the Chronicles. Now that may seem like a meaningless detail, but that is going to come back up. This is important. This is one of those things you want to file away because it's coming back. Now in chapter 3, we meet the villain of the book of Esther. At least the earthly villain. I think the devil could probably be said to be the ultimate villain, as he is always the ultimate villain, I guess. But we meet the villain. His name is Haman, the Agagite. Anybody remember anything about Agag, assuming it's the same, from the same group that's called Agagites, or from Agag in the past in Jewish history? Not sure. Maybe it's the same. But Agag was the leader, the king who Saul was supposed to put to death, and he didn't. And Samuel had to do it instead. So if that's the same one, it's kind of interesting that Haman is an Agagite. That may be a direct result of them not doing as they were supposed to do in the land of Canaan by getting rid of all the inhabitants. Well, all at the king's gate were to bow down and pay homage to this man Haman. And he was a puffed up, spoiled little brat. That's what he was. And that's the kind way to put it. If I put it the real way, I would have to repent and ask your forgiveness. And we'll just go ahead and not do that. So he was a spoiled little brat. And everybody was to bow down to him and pay homage to him as he passed by. So if you're in a hurry someday, you better hope that you don't run into Haman the Agagite, because you're going to have to bow down and do all this mess as he passes by. And he probably doesn't pass by quickly. He probably passes by really slowly so he can really soak up all the glory he can possibly get. Well, this also implies worship, by the way, to bow down in worship. So that's involved in this. So based on the first commandment of the law of Moses, Mordecai refuses to do this. So, as you can imagine, a man like Haman the Agagite, nobody refuses to bow down and pay homage to him without him noticing. So he now has a personal vendetta against Mordecai. He warns him several times. Some servants told Haman, and he is furious. But he is not going to be satisfied with punishing Mordecai alone. He decides, I'm going to exterminate the entire race of his people. That shows you what kind of man this is. Heads can't get any bigger than this. I don't want to just punish him or his family. I want to exterminate his entire race, because he did this. So that is setting up the plot of this. So Haman goes to the astrologers, or the magician, the sorcerer, to cast Pur. Okay, P-U-R. Lots is what the word means. Or lot. as we've pointed out in the past, the suffix im is plural. So Purim means lots. That's the basis of the name of the feast, the celebration, because of the casting of lots, where Haman was going to determine the favorable day to execute his grand scheme of killing all of Mordecai's people. So Haman persuaded the king and sealed these letters. They went out, it says, with instruction to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews in one day. So they're going to put forth the preparations to find all the Jews in the entire empire, which is the entire civilized world, which would be all the Jews at this time, in one day. That's verses 8 through 14. The single greatest threat that God's people had ever faced, and maybe ever did face in the history of, even to this day. So, as we pointed out, if Haman succeeds, the Christ will never come into the world, because there goes all the Jews. This is a big deal. It's not just about the Jews. It's about the world at large. You and me, even. So, God made provision to prevent this day long ago when He told Saul to destroy all the Amalekites and so on. But Saul didn't obey. And it's very well the case possible that if they had done what they were told to do, there would be no Haman. Haman wouldn't exist. But here they are. And now they're in a major threat. So Haman now stands in the way of God's ultimate plan of redemption. What's he going to do? What is God going to do? Well, He's going to do maybe what we might not expect. We might expect surely God is going to have to step in, firsthand directly and just strike Haman dead, or strike all the people that are involved in this dead. But what we read, Mordecai hears the news. This is chapter 4. He tears his clothes, he puts on sackcloth and ashes, he goes out in the midst of the city and cries with a loud and bitter cry, it says. People are going to see this. He meant for people to see this. Esther sends clothes to Mordecai so that he could come to her, because if you were in sackcloth and ashes, you weren't allowed to even enter into the king's gate. So she tries to get him to, remove his sackcloth and ashes so that she could come and speak with her, because she may not know what in the world's going on. Why is he doing this? But he refuses. He will not. He is devastated. So she sent one of the eunuchs out to Mordecai, and he informed him of what this mourning is about. And that eunuch goes to Esther. Now here was the big problem. Mordecai suggests that Esther go before the king. But that puts her in a dilemma. And by the way, that's the big thesis statement of the book of Esther. Or maybe not the thesis statement, but the most powerful verse. Esther 4:14. Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? God, if you don't do anything, Esther, God is going to save our people somehow. But who knows? God may have elevated you to the kingdom for just this very moment and occasion. So why don't you take it upon yourself to be God's instrument in this? That's what he's saying in verse 14. Very powerful verse. But here's the problem. It is a capital offense to go into the king without being summoned by the king. So if you have some urgent business to take to the king, that's just too bad. You can't go in there. You can't knock, even if you knock politely. You can't go in there unless the king summons you. So if the king has business with you, you're going to go before the king whether you want to or not. If the king does not have any business with you, you're not going before the king whether you want to or not. So that's what she tells him. she says, he has not summoned me to him in a month. It's been over a month since the king summoned me. I can't just go in there. So, by the way, that scepter or staff that she refers to, the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter, this is an image here of one of the ancient Persian kings. There he is holding that thing, that scepter, exactly as she points out here. So if somebody goes in there, if he holds that thing out, then you can let out the biggest sigh of relief that you ever have in your lifetime. If he doesn't, that's your life. Gone. Capital offense. Well, Esther told them to tell Mordecai to go and gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. And I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai telling her, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this, she took that to heart, and she says, okay, I'm going to do it. If I die, I die. But first, let's fast for 3 days and 3 nights. You fast, get all the Jews you can find in the capital here to fast with you, and I and my young women will also do that. And then I'll go. Here's just another example of this pairing of, I don't guess prayer is mentioned directly, but it's always implied because the Jews were always combined. Prayer and fasting. It's almost like they viewed that, and not totally, I don't think they're wrong necessarily. Prayer and fasting is like a supercharged prayer. It's more impactful, more meaningful to God. And again, they may be onto something there, because fasting was certainly something that was commonly practiced in the Old Testament. Jesus fasted on occasion. It meant something, and we could learn something from that. But this is what the plan was. It says on the 3rd day, Esther was going to go in there and do this. And thankfully, she got the golden. He extended the scepter to her, and she requested that he come to a feast that she's prepared. Come to lunch. I've made you lunch. Come to eat. And as they were at the table, he said, what do you really want? Because he knew that she didn't go in there to ask him to come and eat. What do you want? It shall be granted to you. What is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. And she said, here's my request. Come to lunch tomorrow. She's really tiptoeing into this. And make sure Haman comes. That's tricky, isn't it? What's this about? Well, we'll see. So Haman goes out that day, because Haman was there at this lunch because the king summoned him to do as she had asked. She invited Haman to the first one too, but not quite in the same, doesn't have the same ring to it as the second time. Haman goes out. He's so happy. You know why he's so happy? Because he feels important. The queen invited me to a dinner. Just me and the king. Me and the king. There's my company right there. There's nobody else. Me and the king. But guess what? He sees Mordecai at the gate, and Mordecai does not bow down. And he was filled with rage. So he goes home. And by the way, here's a good picture of this man. Verse 12, chapter 5, verse 12. Haman said, even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared, and tomorrow also I am invited to go together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. As long as Mordecai's alive, I can't enjoy anything because he won't bow down to me. So he goes home to all his wife and all his friends, probably pouts to them and complains and moans and, all this pity party. And they say, why don't you build a gallows? Verse 14, by the way, I don't know if your version also says gallows in verse 14. The footnote in my Bible says stake. S-T-A-K-E. And that is a whole lot different than a gallows. When I think of gallows, I think of the Wild West. And I think of the Styx song that talks about the gallows. Can't remember which song it is. But anyway, totally different than a stake. I don't know which one I would rather have, but kind of inclined to think the gallows would be better. A stake is like a big spike that you're going to be put on. That doesn't sound fun at all. Neither one of them sound fun, but that sounds horrific. That's probably impaling is probably what they were going to do to Mordecai. That was their plan. So he goes joyfully, or pleased, he has it made. He has this thing made. So here's the second most important verse in the book of Esther. On that night, this is verse 1 of chapter 6, on that night the king could not sleep. Another seemingly meaningless detail, but it is a very important verse because this starts this domino effect. He couldn't sleep. The Hebrew says the king's sleep fled. So he said, bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, to read from that to me. That'll put you right out, I guarantee it. That's like Benadryl, the book of the Chronicles of Memorable Deeds. He thought so anyway. And it just so happened that this man, whoever brought this book in there, read from the section that recorded how Mordecai saved the king's life from those two would-be assassins. And he says, wait a minute, did we ever do anything for that man, Mordecai? And they said, no, nothing's been done for him yet. The king said, okay, who's in the court? Guess who was in the court? Haman. He said, bring Haman in here. And so here comes Haman. And the king says, Haman, I got a proposition for you. You tell me what you think. And he tells him how these two thugs were going to assassinate him he tells him that something great needs to be done. Honor. He doesn't give him all the details, but this great honor needs to be done for somebody that hasn't been done yet. And it probably this thing happened a lot where somebody does something, they need to be honored. So he says, something needs to be done for the man in whom I delight. What do you think ought to be done? Well, Haman, in his narcissistic big-headedness, he thinks he's talking about him. Of all the people in the whole city or empire, he thinks he's talking about him. So he thinks he's saying, what honor should I do you? That's how he heard this, or he's thinking he's talking about me. So he goes all out. He says, okay, let royal robes be brought, which you have worn yourself, and the horse that you have ridden yourself, and on whose head a royal crown is set. Let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let that most noble official dress the man that you're talking about and wanting to honor, and let him lead him around on this horse that you yourself have ridden while he's wearing the robe that you yourself have worn, and so on and so forth. This was a big deal. I mean, this was a great honor. Let one of your highest, most noble officials dress him like a servant and lead him around. But his world's about to be turned upside down. Because the king then says, after he's done, he says, okay, Haman, you better hurry up and do just like you said to Mordecai the Jew. What a turn of events. That's one of the greatest gotcha moments, I like moments like this. Yes! If I'm watching a movie of Esther, I'm like, I love this. I'm really liking this. because nobody's going to like Haman. So he, of all people, not only is he not talking about him, he's talking about his mortal enemy. And he, to his very limited credit, he does it. He sucks it up. He takes it like a big boy. He dresses Mordecai in these robes, leads him around, and this is when he goes and really mopes to his wife and his friends, all these yes people around him that are going to just coddle his poor little self. And that's verse 13 of chapter 6. It says, Then his wise men and his wife said to him, If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you're not going to overcome him. You will surely fall before him. They're smarter than he is. They put this together. That's almost just like what Gamaliel said to the Jewish leaders. He said, look, if this movement, the church, is from God, if these men are from God, you're not going to prevail, so there's no point trying. If it's not from God, they're not going to prevail, so there's no point in you trying. So either way, stay out of it. That's kind of what they're telling Haman. You stay out. Stay away from this Mordecai. You do not want to make him your enemy, because if he is of the Jewish people, he's going to win. Makes you wonder what gave them that impression. Something may have happened in the past that led them to the conclusion that the Jewish people have some kind of powerful deity on their side. Because if he's a Jew, you're not going to prevail. Yeah, Joe?
When he got upset with Mordecai for not bowing before him, the English Standard said it disdained him to even kill him. I mean, he thought Mordecai was like a dog or worse. And so to do this was total humiliation. It wasn't just that he disliked Mordecai, but he was totally humiliated in front of everyone.
Yep.
And I keep thinking of the first one, look yourself on the side of it.
Yeah, this could have been a turning point in Haman's life. That humiliation could have resulted in humility, self-humility. And then his family and friends even were the voice of reason. So not only did he rejected the first opportunity to humble himself, he's also rejecting the voice of reason about, hey, if this Mordecai is a Jew, then you're not going to prevail, so just stay out of it. Quit while you're ahead. You may not feel like you're ahead, but you are, because if you keep on this track, you are in big trouble. Well, to speed up here, at lunch the next day, Esther reveals Haman's wicked plot to the king. And Haman ends up being crucified on that same gallows that he had created for Mordecai. It's the short version. And unfortunately, just like with Daniel in the lion's den and Darius, the law can't be reversed. Even though it was done under, sketchy circumstances and dishonest, that law, it was put into law, so it couldn't be overturned. So what are they going to do? Well, Esther secures the right for the Jewish people to legally fight and defend themselves on that day. So they can't say, because of that horrible system of law, they can't say, no, that day nobody is to raise a single finger against the Jewish people. That's done. They couldn't do that. But what they could do, or try to do, is secure the right to defend themselves. And that's what the king allowed them to do. Every Jew is allowed to, in fact, the king says, here's my pen and my signet ring. You write whatever you want. That is a huge honor. Whatever you want. What if he wrote, it is the law of the king to kill the king? I guess he could have done that. He gave him his ring and everything. But he trusted this man, obviously. He knew that he was a good man, even if Xerxes was a psychopath. He at least knew that Mordecai was a good man. And what they wrote was they could have also, by the way, written that the Jews are to actually, let's see, what was the day? Adar the 13th. They could have written, on Adar the 12th, the Jews are to kill all those people. That'll get them, won't it? If we kill them on the 12th, then they won't be able to kill us on the 13th. But they didn't do that because, again, these are decent, godly people, some of them at least. So what they put in there was simply to defend themselves. And so Esther, by the providence of God, saves the Jewish people from extinction, from extermination, and therefore saves us because, again, Jesus came from them. And so God was doing all this to, just like Joseph said, God sent me to Egypt to preserve a people for life, which really wasn't just their family or even their people, but all the people of the world. God sent Joseph to Egypt for all the people of the world because the Savior would come through them ultimately. Same thing with Esther. God saved the people, Esther's people, because He loves you and me. We looked at John 3:16 this morning. God so loved the world that He sent Joseph to Egypt. God so loved the world that He made Esther the queen of Persia. Because all of that resulted in the sending of His Son to the earth to die for our sins. So, because of this great deliverance, Mordecai recorded all these things and inaugurates the feast of Purim, and declares that it is to be observed from then on for the rest of time. And they obligated, they agreed with that they would, without fail, they would keep these 2 days according to what was written at the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim shall never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. That is what the book of Esther records. Chapter 10 just pretty much finishes up that Mordecai was second in rank to King Xerxes. He was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. Mordecai is a great Bible hero, just as much as Esther was. Mordecai is, but God is the real hero of the book of Esther, and that's why it's so interesting that the book of Esther is the only book in the Bible that doesn't ever mention God by name or by the word God. No, it's the only book. Every single book of the Bible, even Job, even Ecclesiastes, even Lamentations, every book mentions God except Esther, and I think that was by the design of the Holy Spirit. We learn a lesson in that. Look how much God was doing. But He's never mentioned. He's never seen in the text directly, and that's exactly how life is today. God is all over the place, working behind the scenes, but we never see Him. He never appears before us and says, "Hey, I'm God. I'll be here if you need me," and then vanishes again, or He's not always before us, our eyes, that is, but He is. His presence is everywhere, and He can do things behind the scenes, great things that have a tremendous consequence like this, because of His love for us. Mm-hmm.
He always uses, I looked up the word Hadassah, which was her Jewish name, which meant a myrtle tree. It's a small thing. She was a woman, and she was the least of all, and yet she was used for His purpose.
Yeah.
If you look at, we were discussing this, that you look for the great armies, they'll protect us, whatever. No, He always takes the smallest.
Yeah.
to do good things.
This young Jewish girl is what she was. A great Bible hero.
With no power.
No power. And as much as Mordecai did, none of what Mordecai did would have been possible without Esther, except saving the king's life, which played a big role later. But if Esther had not done her part, then nothing that Mordecai did after that would have ever been able to happen, because Esther's role in it led to Mordecai's ability.
But unless you lose your life, you can't get life from the Lord. What she did when she stood up is, if I die, I die.
Yep.
She did what was right, regardless.
Mm-hmm. Even if I die, at least I will have, at least this will be the reason why I die, because I tried to save God's people. That's a worthy death as far as Esther was concerned. She didn't want to die. That's why she said, I can't just go in there. It's death penalty if I don't see get his approval. But after Mordecai, after they exchanged a few times through this messenger, she realized this, I may die, but it'll be a good death. God will be pleased, and therefore I want to do it.